What a great crowd. I hope that you've had a great morning tea and you had a little bit of a chance to network with a few of your colleagues and peers. I'm enjoying it right up until now, and I'm sure that's going to continue with our next speaker. It's Darren, and I'm sure I'm not pronouncing the name right, Menachensum. And Darren is actually going to talk about ethics in a digital age. So I'm really looking forward to hearing about the things that Darren's done in the past as well. Darren is a Think Place partner. His focus is on applying design thinking to intractable challenges in both the OECD and developing countries. Darren has worked extensively in health, international development, border management, energy systems, social protection, regulatory compliance and digital government. That's fantastic. Darren co-designs complex, sensitive environments to develop strategy, programs, policy and services. He has pioneered powerful approaches to linking strategy and architecture to the experience of users and advises executive groups, project teams and boards on how to optimise their impact when taking on these types of at-scale initiatives. Please join me in welcoming Darren.
We're only a few decades into the digital age. Only 2 decades out from here, in fact, when the beginnings of the web started to emerge as we're familiar with it today. But in those 2 decades, what's happened has been actually quite remarkable. In the years between 1996 and now, both government and society have gone through a transition at a scale that nobody could have predicted. We've witnessed the first generations of true digital natives, people who have really never experienced an analog world or a pure analog world, growing up, coming into the workforce and starting to reshape the way things work. We've watched the rise of social media and its mix of toxic and favourable effects on society. We've seen terms like fake news, internet trolls, cyber warfare come into the vernacular, and we've also started to see some very powerful concepts like the sharing economy, artificial intelligence, big data become more normalised and commonplace. We are now creatures that have both a physical and a digital form. Almost all of us have some sort of digital identity, and often we have many. In fact, more than often, it's usually the case, right? Because we have an identity on Facebook, we have an identity with the government as a citizen, we have an identity as a public servant, we have an identity with institutions like banks. And we use those daily, and each one of those represents ourselves in quite a different way. So, this all seems so commonplace now, but until 20 years ago, the popular imagination always expected that the rise of technology was going to look something like this. Big, conspicuous things that would dominate our living rooms and our workplaces. Even back in the late 19th century, when we had a mechanized view of technology, it was very much about things and how these would benefit our lives in various ways. But we were wrong. Instead, what we've seen is a much more quiet and comprehensive integration of digital technology into our lives. There are no big machines, there's no flashy graphics. The digital age is a little device that fits into our pocket. It's a little smart speaker that you put next to a vase on your coffee table in your living room. It's the invisible transmission that happens when you go to the doctor and your information updates a health record. It is all of these quiet things that are happening often below the surface, but which have a massive impact on our lives. This is the digital mesh, a barely noticeable, highly interconnected network of touchpoints. Its platforms, its databases, its connections. We subtly and sometimes overtly interact with it. Every time we want to book a hotel, organise a date, organise an event, bring a family together, pay a traffic fine, register for a government service. It's woven into every aspect of our lives. And even though as a society we don't always trust it, and we don't always trust the institutions behind it either, it is there and it's there to stay. So one thing is certain. The benefits, the convenience, the opportunity to help people and to make society work better is too great to forego this digital transition. And we are very much in a period where we're kind of re-architecting society. We're all participants, whether we like it or not. If we have a digital presence or not, we're all participants. And that places some very interesting duties and some very interesting opportunities on the government. So, just a bit about me. I won't say much because I've already been beautifully introduced, but that's how you spell that name. That is, I get wrong sometimes, but you got right, Irma, so thank you very much. So what does the opportunity look like for government? Agency integration, big data and artificial intelligence are three really important things that are happening at the moment. They offer some really incredible evolutions in how government manages and administers. And I might just run through each one very quickly, although I'm sure people have a reasonably good grounding of what each of those means. When we talk about agency integration, we're often talking about more coordinated services. We mean that government can exchange information, create processes across agency, sometimes across jurisdiction, sometimes even across sector. And in working across those boundaries, it can have this amazing effect on people's lives. Think about those life events like when you have a bereavement or the birth of a child. When to navigate that experience, you have to touch in with many agencies. You have to go through some pretty complicated processes. And you have to do it at a time in your life when you've already got other things to worry about. The ability for agencies to integrate and come together in a much more strategic and a much more kind of compassionate way means that people can do what they need to do in maybe one experience or even have a lot of it happen behind the scenes. Big data is all about collecting a lot of data, putting data sets together, and in joining up that type of data, so say, joining up maybe health data, maybe urban planning data, maybe education data, you suddenly get this very wide view that you can use to drive things like policy innovation, to draw conclusions that you couldn't draw before. And it is already having a very powerful impact around the world and how people think about the challenge of government. The third opportunity I just wanted to mention was artificial intelligence. And at the moment, artificial intelligence still feels a bit futuristic, but it's not actually, it's here. And it's probably going to create one of the biggest pieces of this digital transition that we're all going to experience over the next couple of years. Artificial intelligences are algorithms that can learn, can grow in sophistication and complexity, and can make increasingly accurate predictions. And those predictions can drive things like targeting interventions, targeting services, even, again, at a policy level, trying to work out where a policy or a program might be best targeted to have the maximum impact on society. So it is these types of technologies that are driving big picture change and big picture evolution in the models of government. So this is exciting, but there's also quite a significant ethical challenge that we're going to be facing. And public service leaders are going to be grappling with these challenges almost day to day, not in a theoretical and abstract way, but in terms of real decisions that they're going to have to make. And having the tools and having the understanding about how to make those judgments that are going to result in a better outcome for society is one of the things that the public service needs to build capacity in. Not that it doesn't have it already, but the digital paradigm offers a whole lot of very novel challenges that people may not have necessarily experienced before. So let's run through a couple of those. One ethical challenge is about how we guard against bias and how we guard against unintended consequences. And this becomes quite critical, particularly in service delivery. I want to just raise one or two examples. People might know the NGO Samaritan. It's a really fantastic organisation based out of the UK and it's Ireland. They, a couple of years ago, released an app which was called Radar, and this is what it did. Basically, a person would register on the app. They would choose a friend to monitor. That monitoring would target their Twitter feed.
And if the friend was posting things that seemed to indicate trouble, for example, help me, or maybe phrases associated with suicidal ideation, the app would alert the person monitoring them. They could then subtly reach out, say hello, check that everything was okay, maybe give a nudge to that person's friends to kind of engage and activate their support network. Now, a really fantastic idea with a really great intent, but it shut down after 9 days. And I suspect that in this room, nobody would really be surprised by that because there were some enormous flaws associated with it. For example, people were able to piggyback on the app to start monitoring people, not for the purposes of helping them, but for stalking, for bullying. Internet trolls quite enjoyed the experience. Secondly, there was no consent sought from the person who was actually being monitored. It was kind of done almost covertly. And so effectively the app could potentially either accurately or inaccurately disclose information to another party about mental health and those types of sensitive details. Samaritan went into it with the best of intentions, but they never really connected with the people who was going to affect. And so a very novel new model turned into something that really caused more harm than good. One of those unintended consequences of experimentation with new models without connecting with the people they're going to affect. Another, and this is becoming quite a well-known example of unintended consequences, and maybe a premier example of algorithmic bias, is a story which starts with a young girl, Brisha Borden. She's 14. She's walking down the street, going to the school where her younger sister attends to pick her up. And she and the friend that she's with are both running late. They look in a garden that they're passing and they see that there is a scooter and a little child's bicycle, and they think, maybe we should take those, and maybe that'll help us get to the school quicker. So they grab the bicycle and the scooter. They try to use it, but after about 3 or 4 seconds realized that they were made for maybe a 5 or a 6-year-old, so they discarded them. By that time, the mother who owned those toys ran out of the house, yelled thief, and neighbours saw it all, called the police, and a little while later, Brisha and her friend were being detained by police. And so that's Brisha's story. There's another story of a man named Vernon Prater. He was picked up for a similar level of theft, about $100 worth of tools from a Walmart in the States. He had a history of violent crime, and when you looked at his past, he had been in prison previously, and he had done things that were in some ways pretty disturbing. There was an algorithm that advised parole boards the level of risk associated with anybody who was sort of moving through that parole process. And Brisha's score was an 8 out of 10. She was considered to be a very high risk. Vernon Prater's score was a 3 out of 10. He was considered to be a very low risk. This was part of a pattern, with people being rated highly even though they were low risk of reoffending. And in fact, time bore that out, and people who got rated high were actually, in many ways, less likely to offend. Again and again. And an investigation by ProPublica in 2016 arrived at the conclusion that the parole advisory app, which was called Compass, was basically making decisions based on race. It was making racist decisions. It was making racist decisions because the way it had been trained, the bias of the people who had created it, and various other factors had led it to unintentionally, but in hundreds of cases, create very unjust outcomes. This is a bit of post-analysis. Labelled high risk but didn't reoffend, 23.5% white, 44.9% African American. So you can see it was really a topsy-turvy outcome. So what was happening here was that there was algorithmic bias, but that's not the most interesting thing. I think the most interesting thing, I almost harken back to something you were saying a little bit earlier, Attractor, which was about the human factor. Because this big expensive, sophisticated artificial intelligence algorithm was giving parole boards, who really should have known better, advice about risk scoring. But they didn't feel authorized to question it. They didn't feel like they had the ability to challenge the machine, and they felt that the personal risk involved in challenging it was actually going to potentially get them in trouble, particularly if they challenged it and then were wrong. And so effectively that systematized quite a significant injustice. So what does that mean for the ethical challenge? Well, it means how do you guard against bias is going to be a huge part of what we need to think about as we adopt these technologies, but also the relationship between human beings and what the technologies create is going to need some attention. And that's a training issue, it's a culture issue, and it's a mindset issue. And it's going to get more and more significant at every level as we roll forward into this digital transition. A second ethical challenge I want to talk about is how we make sure that we're acting within our social license. And I'm sure some people in the room have encountered that idea before, some haven't. I might just talk about what social license is. Social license really came into its own about 15 to 20 years ago when it started to be used by the extraction industry, the mining industry, to say, well, if we're going to go and put a big hole near your town, and it's going to potentially, ruin your view, and there's potentially going to be some pollution and environmental issues. What can we do? How can we work with your community to make sure that we are getting your consent, that we are giving you back enough value, that this becomes a fair exchange? And social license has been used for many years as a reframing of kind of a more antagonistic way of how business and communities get along. It's been picked up very strongly by government. And when we talk about social license, what we're saying is that across the community, people have the opportunity to either reject an initiative or maybe just tolerate it, maybe to approve it if they think that it's actually going to be good for them, or maybe to embrace it if they can really start to strongly identify with it. Knowing what social license you have for government initiatives is really going to be a determining factor in whether or not a program is going to be successful. Because if you don't have high social license, it will be rejected by the community. And I'm sure we can all think of programs that have done that, have that happened to them in the past, even though at their core they were very well intentioned, but also actually quite effective. They just didn't have that community license. Social license is one of those challenging things because it's not homogeneous. Lots of different people have lots of different feelings about projects, and so it's, you don't get social license easily. It requires building up trust, and trust is something that's hard to build. In social license theory, trust is often described in this way: a willingness to be vulnerable to risk or loss through the actions of another. If you're trusting somebody, you're making yourself vulnerable, and that's a very uncomfortable thing to do. So the ethical challenge for government is really, how do you build that trust with the community? How do you build that social license? And I'm going to introduce a new term here. Social license is slowly, still there strongly as a term, but in government it's starting to become framed as community trust, because that's what it's all about. So how do you create the community trust which is going to allow you to act and act in a way that meets community expectations? The third ethical challenge that I'd like to talk about is about how we make judgments when there is no clear right or wrong. And this is often the case where we're not trying to work out, as Rushworth Kidder would say, right versus wrong issues, but we're actually looking at right versus right issues. Rushworth Kidder was a pretty incredible ethicist. He ran the Institute for Global Ethics for a long time, and he dies in about 2012, but part of his body of work was saying the most complex issues of right versus right are the ones where public administrators need to give the most attention and consideration. They're the hardest to crack. One example of a right versus right issue is something that's emerged only in the last couple of years, and it's a notion called right to explanation. This has come out strongly in the EU. People might be familiar with the General Data Protection Regulations, which were passed there in the last year or so, which gives very strong rights to people around how their information is used and various other things associated with digital transition matters. And one of them is this: artificial intelligences make decisions that can affect people's lives. In having a service targeted towards you, in having some sort of regulatory action targeted towards you, it's going to have an effect maybe on the amount of time you need to spend, on the stress that you feel, various other implications, obviously. And in many cases, you deserve a right to know why that happened. But the problem with artificial intelligence is that it's so complicated, it grows so organically, that it's actually quite hard to explain why an AI took a particular decision. It's not like you can go to the program and say, what code did you write? Or you can go to the person who made the rules and say, what rules did you apply? Because the AI has learnt and it's created its own set of rules. So the tension here is, do we go as far as we can with artificial intelligence, knowing that as we become more and more sophisticated, we're going to be less and less able to explain why we've done something? Or do we err on the side of right to explanation and say, we will make sure that we will limit the power of artificial intelligence so that we never lose the ability to explain why an administrative decision was made? Both of those have consequences. One has consequences for society in terms of the benefit that it would get from AI. One has consequences for individual in terms of their right to know why something was done. And there are a lot of midpoints where you can land in terms of that debate. How far do you go in each direction? But harnessing the power of this digital transition, this digital age, means that we're going to have to grapple with this. And we're going to have to work out not just what's in the interests of creating an optimized administration, but what social license do we have? What social license don't we have? And how do we build up to where we need to be? In Europe, right explanation is quite strong because of those regulations, and a lot of countries around the world are now trying to decide where do we go with this and what do we lock ourselves into. And I think it'll be coming to in Australia near you at some point. Rushworth-Kidder had 4 tests which he used to apply to ethical dilemmas, and I think they're incredibly relevant, not just to general ethics, but also to the challenges that we find in this digital space. First, he said, there's a legal test. And this isn't really an ethical test, it's more like a compliance test, which, is within the law. If it isn't, you should probably not do that. But then come the more discretionary tests. So he talked about the stench test. It's basically, does this kind of stink? Does this just feel wrong? And the stench test is really a proxy for saying, what is your gut instinct saying? What do you as a person value? And how do you feel about this as a good idea or a bad idea? So if your initiative passes the stench test, then we're on to the front page test. And the front page test is really about asking the question, if this appeared on the front page of a major national newspaper, how would you feel? Would you feel like you could defend it? Would you feel uncomfortable with it? The front page test is a proxy for community values and sort of community norms. How does it fit in with what society says is okay or is not okay? The third test is the mother test. And this is about, a question of, would you go and tell your mum what you did today? Would you tell her about the decision that you were being made? And obviously, it doesn't have to be a literal mother. The mum is a proxy for somebody who represents a values paragon, who you aspire to be or you aspire to get the approval of. It is very hard sometimes to make quantitative judgments about what's going to be best for society, and it's not impossible, but it's sometimes hard. It's almost impossible to make a decision when there are two right ways of doing something. But these tests are a tool that you can use every day with every challenge to at least get a grounding in terms of where you should be falling or what the right course of action might be. We talk about an age of digital abrasion, and I think you might have even made a reference to this in your opening speech today, which is what we can do with digital technology and with the models that it enables is incredibly powerful. It really does allow us to play with the fundamentals. What is possible is not necessarily aligned with what the community thinks is acceptable. This is a model which we've adapted slightly from a professor at Oxford University. His name's Luciano Floridi. And he's the head of Oxford's Digital Ethics Lab. And he says that when you're thinking about, how you design ethical digital innovation, you really need to think about three pieces of the story. Digital governance. What policies are actually going to be best for society? What should we allow digital to do? What should we allow it to be? And who gets to make that decision? Governance can be those formal governance structures, like political structures, public service structures. They can also be those informal structures. Digital governance often results in things like new laws, new standards. The second area to think about is digital ethics, which asks the question, what do we value as a society? What does our culture say is okay? What norms should we appreciate and adhere to? What beliefs do we need to respect and consider? Digital regulation is all about asking the question, how do we shape this digital transition? We might have laws, but how do we actually bring that into effect? We've got tools like enforcement, regulation, awareness, right through to soft tools like activism or market support. And what we try to aim for is to get into that magic middle, where we say, we know at a high level what society is going to benefit from, and we know where the risks are, and we're going to make rules and laws and standards that are going to bring us into that, into a good, virtuous point in that circle. We're also going to make sure that we've got the right tools to turn those laws or those standards or those policy ideas into real positive change. And we're never going to lose sight of the fact that this also needs to make sense in terms of the values of the community. One more word from Luciano. In a paper that he wrote in 2018, he noted that the transition from an entirely analog and offline world to one that is increasingly also digital and online will never happen again in the history of humanity. The last 20 years or so, and probably about the next 10 to 20 years, we're going to be setting powerful precedents that are going to shape what we want society to look like in this coming digital age. And we can do that consciously, or we can do it by a whole lot of small unconscious decisions that are responding to the needs of today or the needs of next week. And I think the biggest challenge for government is, how do you pull back? How do you take that longer term view? And how do you make sure that the decisions you're making here and now are going to lead us on a path towards a world that you'd like to live in? Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Darren. And that was, again, a great sort of thought starter. I'm sure we'll have lots of questions. A couple of takeaways for me. At the heart of it is actually building community trust, vulnerability, and how that's actually linked into our decision making. And I really loved the stuff around right of explanation or right to an explanation. And I think there's some really good messages in some of the things that you talked about. And for me, it's always about being conscious, even if it's challenging your own values and norms. So fantastic.